5 starving children, 1 broke cowboy, and an entire town that chose to look away. In the merciless summer of 1883, when the frontier punished weakness and rewarded only the ruthless, one man made a choice that defied every law of survival the West had ever written. He had nothing, no money, no food, no future worth speaking of. But when he saw those 5 forgotten souls crumbling beside a broken hitching post, something in Rhett Calloway refused to keep writing. What happened next would shake Dry Creek to its very foundation. This is that story. Stay with me until the end, and drop your city in the comments so I can see just how far this tale has traveled. The horse had stopped sweating 2 miles back. That was the first sign Rhett Calloway noticed. Not the cracked earth splitting open beneath Copper's hooves like old leather boots left too long in the sun. Not the sky bleached the color of a dead man's face. Not even the stench of something rotting off to the east where Harlan Creek used to run. No. It was the horse going dry that told him just how bad things had gotten. Easy, boy. He leaned forward in the saddle and pressed one cracked palm against Copper's neck. The animal's muscles trembled beneath his hand. Not from exertion, but from pure bone-deep exhaustion. Rhett knew that particular kind of trembling. He'd felt it in his own legs more than once in the past 3 weeks. Dry Creek appeared on the horizon the way mirages always did out here. Slowly, reluctantly, as if the town itself resented being seen. A cluster of sun-bleached buildings hunched along a single main road, their painted signs faded to near nothing by seasons of merciless wind and heat. The livery stable, Hargrove's General Store, the dusty Spur Saloon, where laughter still managed to leak through the swinging doors even in the worst of times. A church with a cracked bell that nobody rang anymore. Rhett had ridden 4 days to reach this place, and he'd done it on half rations and raw determination. His ranch, if a man could still call it that without laughing bitterly at the word, sat 11 miles east of town on 43 acres of what had once been decent grazing land. Had once been. That was the operative phrase now, the 2 words that haunted every rancher in the territory. The drought had come in April like a quiet executioner, and by July it had done its work thoroughly. The grass was gone. The creek bed was a scar of pale, cracked mud. 3 of his 6 cattle had wandered off in search of water he couldn't provide, and the remaining 3 looked at him each morning with eyes that held a terrible, patient accusation. He'd ridden to Dry Creek because he was out of flour, out of salt pork, out of coffee, and dangerously close to out of options. He had $11.40 to his name, the last of what he'd scraped together from selling a saddle he'd owned for 9 years. And he needed to stretch it far enough to keep himself alive until he figured out what came next. He didn't yet know that $11.40 was about to become much more complicated. The main street of Dry Creek was busier than he'd expected for a Tuesday afternoon in the dead of summer. Ranchers' wives moved quickly between storefronts, their faces tight with the particular anxiety of women who were quietly rationing everything and telling no one. A group of old men sat outside the barber shop and watched the world with the detached patience of men who had stopped expecting it to improve. 2 cowboys from the Hargrove spread leaned against a post outside the saloon, and they nodded at Rhett with that brief economical acknowledgement that passed for warmth between men who worked the land. He tied Copper to the rail outside the general store and gave the animal a long look. "Don't go anywhere," he said, because talking to his horse was something he'd started doing somewhere around week 2 of the solitude, and he'd long since stopped being embarrassed about it. He was almost to the door of Hargrove's when he heard it. A sound so small that the noise of the street nearly swallowed it whole. A thin, reedy whimper. The kind that had been going on long enough that the person making it had almost stopped hoping anyone would respond. Rhett stopped. He turned slowly, the way a man turns when some instinct older than thought tells him to pay attention. They were huddled beside the broken hitching post at the far end of the building. The post that had been split by a runaway wagon 2 summers ago and never repaired. The one everyone in town had simply stopped seeing. 5 of them. Children. Pressed together in the narrow strip of shadow the building's overhang provided, as if they understood that direct sunlight might finish what hunger had started. The oldest looked about 16, a lean, sharp-faced boy with dark circles beneath his eyes, and a jaw set so hard it might have been carved from the same rock that built these hills. He had one arm around a girl who looked maybe 13, her hair matted, her dress so dirty the original color was a memory. 2 younger boys, perhaps 9 and 11, sat pressed against the wall with their knees pulled to their chests. And then the smallest, a girl of about 7, was tucked against the oldest boy's side with her face buried in his shoulder, and she was the one making that sound, that thin, hopeless whimper that was almost worse than crying. Rhett stood very still and looked at them. Around him, Dry Creek continued its afternoon business. A woman walked past and let her eyes slide away from the children with practiced efficiency. The old men outside the barber shop glanced over and then resumed their conversation. A wagon rolled by, the driver looking straight ahead with magnificent determination. Nobody stopped. He looked at the 5 children again. The oldest boy had noticed him staring. Their eyes met, and what Rhett saw there wasn't the pleading look he might have expected. It was something harder and more devastating. A look that had learned not to expect anything, that had been disappointed so many times it had stopped bothering to register hope. It was the look of someone who had been invisible for so long they'd almost come to believe they were. Rhett Calloway had worn that look himself once. In another life, in another drought, when he was 11 years old and his father's farm in Georgia had gone under and nobody had stopped for them either. He walked over. "When did you last eat?" The oldest boy's jaw tightened. He didn't answer immediately. Working out, Rhett could see, whether this was a real question or the preamble to being moved along. "Yesterday morning," he finally said. "Found some biscuits someone threw out behind the saloon." Yesterday morning. Rhett did the mental arithmetic and felt something cold move through him despite the brutal heat. "All 5 of you?" "All 5 of us." The small girl had lifted her face slightly from the boy's shoulder. Her eyes were enormous in her thin face, dark brown, rimmed red. She was watching Rhett with the careful attention of an animal that has learned to identify danger before it arrives. "I'm Rhett," he said. He crouched down so he wasn't looming over them, his forearms on his knees. "What's your name, son?" Another beat of silence, then, Cole Merritt." He said it like a man giving testimony, last name included, as if daring Rhett to cross-reference it against whatever list of unwanted people he might be carrying. "The others?" Cole nodded toward the 13-year-old girl. "That's my sister Ada. The boys there are Danny and Pete." He glanced down at the small girl against his side. "That's Lily. She's 7. Lily." She was watching Rhett with those enormous eyes and had stopped making the sound, which was almost worse, because it meant she was saving her energy. "Where are your parents, Cole?" Something moved across the boy's face. Quick, painful, controlled. "Mama died in February. Fever. Papa..." He stopped. Started again. "Papa left in May. Said he was going to find work in San Antonio. Said he'd send money." His chin lifted slightly, a gesture of pride protecting something that had been broken. "He didn't." The words fell into the heat like stones into a dry well. Rhett was quiet for a moment. He looked at the 5 children, really looked at them, taking in the details he'd cataloged without quite meaning to. The way Pete's lips were cracked and pale from dehydration, the raw skin on Ada's feet visible through shoes that had worn through. The careful, deliberate stillness of Danny, the 9-year-old, who had that particular watchfulness of a child who had learned that stillness attracted less attention. And Lily, 7 years old, pressed against her brother's side, holding on. Rhett straightened up. He put his hand in his pocket and felt the folded bills there, $11.40, the total sum of his financial life. And he stood in the brutal July sun of Dry Creek, Texas, and made a calculation. It wasn't a complicated one. "Come on," he said. Cole's eyes narrowed. "Come on, where?" "Place down the street does a meal for 15 cents. Hot food. I'm buying." A silence so complete that even the street noise seemed to pause. "Mister," Cole said, and his voice had a warning edge in it. 16 years old and already carrying the weight of a man who'd been cheated before. "We don't need charity." "Good," Rhett said, "because I'm not offering any. I'm hungry. I just rode 4 days and I don't like eating alone. You'd be doing me a favor." He looked at Cole steadily. 5 favors. Cole stared at him, working it out, looking for the angle, the catch, the condition buried in the kindness like a hook inside bait. Lily suddenly pushed herself up straighter and looked at her oldest brother with those enormous eyes. Cole's jaw worked for a moment. Then he looked back at Rhett, and something infinitely small shifted behind his eyes. All right, he said, but we eat together, all 5 of us. Wouldn't have it any other way, Rhett said. He spent $2.70 at May Sutton's eating house at the north end of the street. Not 15 cents a head, as he'd said, but considerably more. Because when he saw how the children ate, he quietly flagged down May and doubled the order without comment. They ate with the focused, silent intensity of people who had stopped pretending hunger was abstract. Even Cole, who had clearly decided to maintain his dignity, cleaned his plate with a thoroughness that said everything his carefully neutral expression refused to. Rhett ate his own food slowly and watched them. May Sutton, a broad, capable woman who had seen most of what the frontier had to offer and maintained her opinions quietly, brought extra bread without being asked and refreshed the water pitcher 3 times. When the younger ones had eaten and the initial desperate edge had faded from their movements, conversation came in pieces. Rhett learned what he could without pressing. Their father had not been a cruel man, only a defeated one, a subtle distinction that Cole clearly wrestled with. They had made their way from their family's failed homestead 40 miles west, walking much of it, sustained by what they could find. They had arrived in Dry Creek 6 days ago. In those 6 days, 3 different townspeople had promised to find them shelter. None had followed through. "Why do you think that is?" Rhett asked. Not as an accusation, just turning the question over. Cole looked at him with those flat, knowing eyes. "Because 5 is a lot," he said simply. "They'd take one of us, maybe. Ada, maybe, for housework. But all 5? He shook his head. "Nobody wants 5. Across the table, Lily had fallen asleep sitting up, her head drooping against Ada's shoulder. Danny and Pete were having a quiet, serious discussion about something. Rhett caught the word horses and lightning and couldn't follow the rest. "Where are you sleeping?" Rhett asked Cole quietly. "Back of the livery. Jensen doesn't know we're there." So they were hiding. Even their shelter was borrowed without permission, precarious, one discovery away from being taken away. Rhett set down his coffee cup. He looked at the 5 children arranged around the table in May Sutton's eating house. Lily sleeping on Ada's shoulder, the boys talking horses, Cole watching him with the tireless vigilance of a 16-year-old who had appointed himself the last line of defense between his family and the world's indifference. He thought about his 11 miles of failing ranch, his 3 remaining cattle, his barn that was half empty, and his house that was more than half empty, the 43 acres of cracked earth and dead grass that were somehow still legally his. He thought about riding home to it alone. Then he said very carefully, "I've got a ranch east of town. It's not much. It's actually in fairly bad shape. I won't lie to you about that. But there's a roof. There's a well that's still giving water. It's not luxury, but it's not nothing." He paused. "You could come out there. All 5 of you." The table went quiet. Even Danny and Pete stopped talking. Cole looked at him for a long, long moment. The evaluation in his eyes was thorough and exhausting to witness. A 16-year-old boy doing the math on every adult who had ever made a promise and then explained with great patience and regret why they couldn't follow through. "What do you get out of it?" Cole asked. It was the right question. Rhett respected him for asking it. "Honestly," Rhett said, "I don't know yet. Maybe nothing. Maybe I'm just a man who's tired of eating alone and doesn't like the look of you all sleeping in Jensen's livery without Jensen's knowledge." He met Cole's eyes. "I'm not going to pretend I've got this all worked out. I don't. My ranch is struggling and I've got more problems than solutions. But I've got more room than I need, and you've got less than you need, and sometimes that's the only math that matters." Cole was quiet. He looked at Ada. Something passed between them. A whole conversation compressed into a glance, the kind of silent communication that develops between siblings who have had to make hard decisions together. Ada gave a small nod. Cole looked back at Rhett. "We work," he said. "We're not charity. If we're on your land, we pull our weight, all of us. Even Lily. Lily's 7. Lily feeds the chickens. She's good at it." Rhett looked at the sleeping 7-year-old. "All right," he said. "Then we've got a deal. Getting 5 children and a tired horse 11 miles out of town in the fading afternoon proved to be a logistical improvisation. Copper, to his considerable credit, carried Lily and Pete without visible protest, while the older 3 walked alongside and Rhett led the horse by the bridle. Danny turned out to be a talker once he'd eaten, a stream of questions and observations that poured out of him like water from a finely opened tap. Is it a big ranch? Not particularly. Do you have horses besides this one? Just Copper. Do you have dogs? No dogs. Why not? Because dogs eat, same as everything else. A pause of consideration. We could get a dog someday. Dogs are useful on a ranch. They help with cattle. That's true. We had a dog once. His name was Captain. He was brown with one white ear. Another pause, shorter this time. He ran off when Papa left. Rhett didn't say anything to that. He just kept walking. Cole walked on the other side of Copper, matching Rhett's pace, not speaking. But once, when the trail curved west and the dying sun painted the dust a deep particular red, Rhett caught the older boy looking at the horizon with an expression that was not quite hope, that was something more careful than hope, something that had been burned back to its roots and was only now, tentatively, thinking about growing again. Rhett said nothing and kept walking. By the time the dark shape of the ranch house appeared against the evening sky, Lily was fully asleep across Copper's back, held in place by Pete's careful hands. The house, a low, weathered structure that had been built for function rather than beauty, sat in the still evening air with its windows dark and its yard empty. Rhett looked at it through the eyes of someone seeing it for the first time and tried to imagine what it looked like to 5 children who had been sleeping in a livery. It needs work, he said, mostly to Cole. So do we, Cole replied, without particular bitterness. Just a statement of fact. Rhett almost smiled at that. Almost. The first night was strange in the way that all genuinely significant things are strange. Not dramatic, not cinematic, but quietly, persistently different in some way that you couldn't fully articulate but couldn't ignore either. He made space in the house the way you make space when you've been living alone and have stopped seeing how much room you're not using. The 2 younger boys got the small room off the kitchen that Rhett had been using for storage. Ada and Lily got his bedroom, which was the only sensible arrangement and which he implemented without being asked because some things don't require discussion. Cole, who had clearly expected to be given the least, was offered the corner of the main room with a cot that Rhett dragged out from under a pile of old harnesses. Cole stood looking at the cot for a moment. "You don't have to give me the better spot," he said. "The loft's too hot in July," Rhett said simply, and went to start a fire for coffee. He sat at his table that night long after the children had fallen asleep, and they had fallen asleep with the absolute immediate totality of the truly exhausted, each of them going under like a candle snuffed. And he sat with a cup of coffee gone cold and did arithmetic on a scrap of paper. The numbers were not encouraging. He had $8.70 left after the meal and a few supplies he'd managed to grab at Hargrove's. He had 3 cattle. He had 43 acres of drought-damaged land. He had a house with a leaking roof in the southwest corner. He had 6 months until the next natural point where any kind of money might come in, and that was assuming something changed dramatically with the weather or the land or his general circumstances, none of which were things he could control. He had now 5 additional people depending on him. He sat with the cold coffee and the inadequate numbers and the strange sound of 5 people breathing quietly in rooms that had been empty for a long time. And he didn't solve anything. He didn't arrive at any conclusion or formulate any plan. He just sat and thought and listened to the breathing. After a while, he went to sleep on the floor beside the cold fireplace, his saddle blanket pulled over him, and outside the drought-ridden land of Dry Creek, Texas stretched away in all directions under a sky full of ungiving stars. He didn't know what came next, but he had stopped. When everyone else kept riding, he had stopped. And somehow, in the economy of things that matter, that felt like the beginning of something, though he couldn't yet have said what. In the days that followed, Rhett Calloway would discover that feeding 5 children on a failing ranch was a problem without clean solutions. Coal would prove both harder and more valuable than expected. The land would give nothing easily, and forces far more powerful than drought would soon turn their attention toward the small, improbable household forming itself in the dust 11 miles east of Dry Creek. But that night, that first quiet, impossible night, was something Rhett would think about for the rest of his life. 5 people breathing in empty rooms. It had been a long time since anything in that house had breathed at all. The first morning arrived without ceremony. Rhett was already outside before the sun had fully cleared the eastern ridgeline, standing at the edge of the yard with a cup of coffee that was more habit than pleasure, surveying the land the way a doctor surveys a patient he already knows is in serious condition. The pasture to the north, what had once been a reliable stretch of grama grass, was the color of old straw now, brittle and thin, whispering against itself in the faint pre-dawn wind. The creek bed that ran along the property's eastern boundary had been dry since late May. He could see the line of it from here, a pale scar threading through the brown landscape, and looking at it produced a particular sensation in his chest that he'd learned to identify and ignore, the feeling of watching something die slowly and being powerless to stop it. He heard the screen door behind him and turned to find Cole standing on the porch, boots already on, hair damp like he'd already been up long enough to splash water on his face. "You're an early riser," Rhett said. "Always have been." Cole stepped down into the yard and looked out at the same landscape Rhett had been studying. He was quiet for a moment. "The grass is bad." "Yes." "How long has it been like this?" "Since April. Came on fast." Rhett took a slow drink of coffee. "We get a good rain in September, the land can recover. Grass like this has deep roots. It's not dead, just waiting." Cole looked at him sideways. "And if we don't get rain in September?" Rhett didn't answer right away, which was itself an answer. "Then we figure something else out," he finally said. Cole nodded slowly, absorbing this with the particular seriousness of someone who has learned not to be surprised by bad news but still feels the weight of it. He crossed his arms over his chest, and in the early morning light, standing in that posture, he looked simultaneously 16 and 45. "What do you need done today?" he asked. That was the beginning of it. Not a dramatic declaration, not a speech about working together, just a 16-year-old boy asking a practical question at dawn, and a tired rancher answering it. The morning unfolded in sections. Rhett showed Cole the fence line along the north pasture that had been losing post to the dry, cracking soil, 3 of them leaning at angles that would invite a cattle escape if ignored much longer. Cole took the tools without being told twice and went to work with a focused, methodical energy that surprised Rhett, though it probably shouldn't have. A boy who had held a family together through the collapse of everything he'd ever depended on did not lack for work ethic. Meanwhile, the younger children emerged in stages. Danny and Pete appeared at the door around 7, blinking in the sunlight with the slightly bewildered look of people who had slept more deeply than they'd expected to and weren't sure how to feel about it. Ada came behind them, already practical, already looking around for what needed doing. And Lily came last, holding Ada's hand, her enormous dark eyes moving slowly around the yard as if she were cataloging it, deciding whether to trust it. Rhett showed her the chicken coop. There were only 6 chickens left. He'd started the year with 11, but the drought had a way of reducing everything. And they regarded Lily with the skeptical hauteur that chickens direct at anyone new. Lily regarded them back with perfect seriousness. "Their names?" she asked. Rhett blinked. They don't have names." Lily looked at him with an expression that made clear she considered this an oversight of some magnitude. "They need names," she said, "so they know you're talking to them." "I don't usually talk to them. That's why they don't lay much," she said, with the absolute confidence of a 7-year-old who has arrived at a conclusion and sees no reason to doubt it. Rhett looked at Ada, who pressed her lips together to keep from smiling. "She's probably right," Ada said. So the chickens got names. Lily assigned them with great deliberation over the following 20 minutes, and by the time she was done scattering grain with the proprietary authority of someone who has claimed a responsibility, 3 of the 6 had already been persuaded to eat from her hand. It was, Rhett thought, watching from the fence, the closest thing to a good omen the property had produced in months. But good omens and bad arithmetic do not cancel each other out. By the end of the first week, Rhett had faced the numbers honestly and found them brutal. His supplies, calculated for one person operating at frontier-level sufficiency, were adequate for perhaps 3 more weeks at the pace 5 growing children required. Ada turned out to be a capable cook who could stretch a meal with an instinctive, almost mathematical creativity, combining the last of the cornmeal and dried beans and salt pork into dishes that were plain but filling. Still, he could see the trajectory clearly. The pantry was a clock, and it was running. He said nothing about this to Cole. Cole, he suspected, already knew. What Cole did not know, what none of them knew yet, was that the ranch's financial situation extended considerably beyond the pantry. The land itself carried a debt, a note held by the Cattlemen's Lending Association in Dry Creek, an organization whose principal feature was its association with the largest and wealthiest ranch operators in the territory. Rhett had taken the debt out 18 months ago during what had seemed like a reasonable gamble on an expanding herd. The drought had made the gamble unreasonable in retrospect. The note was due in full in 4 months, and the sum was $340, a figure that currently lived in Rhett's mind the way a stone lives at the bottom of a boot, always present, always uncomfortable, making every step slightly wrong. He rode into Dry Creek on a Thursday, leaving Cole in charge with instructions that were simple enough. Don't let Pete near the tools, don't let Danny try to fix the water trough himself, and make sure Lily's chickens have water before noon. Cole accepted these directives with a nod that contained somewhere in it a very faint suggestion of amusement. The ride into town was the kind of quiet that feels loud. The landscape on either side of the trail offered nothing but evidence of the drought's patient devastation. Fence lines with dried brush caught against them, a windmill standing still in air that wasn't moving enough to turn it, the distant dark silhouette of the Hargrove Ranch's main house, sitting fat and self-satisfied on its hill, surrounded by land that somehow still showed green because the Hargroves had money enough to pipe water from a source Rhett had never been invited to inquire about. Marcus Hargrove was in front of the dusty spur when Rhett reached town, which was where Marcus Hargrove usually was in the mid-morning, holding court with the comfortable permanence of a man who has never had reason to be anywhere he didn't want to be. He was broad and silver-haired, with the particular kind of handsomeness that wealth maintains past the age when it would otherwise have faded, and he had 2 men flanking him whose primary qualification appeared to be their talent for looking agreeable. "Calloway," Hargrove said, as Rhett rode past. The single word managed to carry both greeting and verdict. Rhett slowed Copper but didn't stop. "Hargrove, heard you picked up some strays." The phrasing was deliberate. Rhett kept his expression neutral. "I took in some children who needed a roof, yes." Hargrove smiled the way a man smiles when he's already decided how a story ends. 5 of them, the way I hear it." He tilted his head. "Calloway, you can barely keep yourself above water. What are you going to do with 5 orphans on failing land?" "Manage," Rhett said. "With what?" Hargrove's voice wasn't cruel exactly. It was something worse than cruel. It was amused. "Your note's due in November. Your cattle aren't worth a third of what you owe. You're going to lose that ranch regardless. All you've done is given those kids a few more weeks of false hope before they end up right back where you found them." He shook his head with theatrical regret. "Should have kept riding, son." Rhett looked at him for a long, even moment. "Appreciate the perspective," he said, and rode on. But Hargrove's words followed him down the street the way the worst words always do. Not because they were new, but because they were articulating something he'd already been thinking at 3 in the morning when he couldn't sleep. He went to the lending association anyway. The man behind the counter, a pale, careful man named Elton Pruitt, whose job appeared to consist entirely of delivering bad news with maximum courtesy, confirmed what Rhett already understood. The note was $340. Due November 15th. Extension was possible only with a 20% premium, which put the figure at $408. There was no flexibility in the association's position because the association's position was largely dictated by its primary investors, who included Marcus Hargrove and 2 other large-scale ranch operators, and flexibility was not in their financial interest. "You understand," Pruitt said, arranging his hands carefully on his desk, "that in the event of default, the property reverts to the association for resale." "I understand," Rhett said. He rode home with no solutions and a harder set to his jaw. The weeks that followed established a rhythm that was simultaneously grinding and strangely, stubbornly alive. Each morning, Cole was up at first light, working the fence line, the yard, whatever presented itself. Danny, who was 9 and constitutionally incapable of remaining still, attached himself to Rhett with an almost physical persistence, appearing at Rhett's elbow during every task with questions that ranged from the practical to the philosophical. Pete was quieter, more interior, given to long silences that he broke occasionally with observations of surprising precision. Ada ran the house with a competence that consistently outpaced her 13 years, and Lily maintained her sovereign authority over the chicken coop with an intensity that had, in fact, marginally improved egg production. Whether this was due to the naming or simply to the more consistent feeding schedule, Rhett chose not to investigate. They were short on food, they were short on money, they were short on time. But the house was not short on life, and Rhett found this distinction doing something unexpected to him, working on him the way water works on stone gradually, without announcement. It was Cole who first pushed back against the silence Rhett kept around the finances. They were mending the roof. The southwest corner had given way in a dry windstorm, and the repair required 2 sets of hands. When Cole, balanced on the roof's edge with a mouthful of nails he was removing one at a time to hammer, paused and said, without preamble, "How bad is it?" Rhett, from where he was steadying the new board, didn't pretend not to understand the question. "Bad enough." Cole took the remaining nails out of his mouth and held them in his fist. "I'm not a child. You're 16. I've been running a family since May. Tell me how bad it is." Rhett looked at him. The boy's face was level, patient, entirely ready for whatever the number was. He had, Rhett realized, almost certainly already calculated it himself based on what he'd observed. $340 by November 15th, Rhett said, "or we lose the land." Cole absorbed this without flinching. He turned it over behind his eyes for a moment, then nodded once. "What's the plan?" "Working on it." "Work faster," Cole said, not unkindly, and went back to the roof. The plain truth was that Rhett was working on it, had been working on it since before the children arrived, and the plan that kept surfacing, the idea that wouldn't leave him alone no matter how many times he dismissed it as foolish, was one he'd been reluctant to voice because voicing it would require committing to it, and committing to it would mean being wrong in front of 5 children if it didn't work. He had found something 2 weeks before he'd ridden to Dry Creek, something that might be nothing, or might be the only thing. He'd been following the high ridgeline east of the property, walking it the way he sometimes did when the ranch's problems became too large for the interior of the house to contain, when he'd noticed the vegetation pattern. A thin strip along the base of the rocky outcropping where the ridge met the flat land, a strip maybe 30 feet wide and 40 feet long, where the plant life was different. Not healthy exactly. Nothing was healthy in July 1883, but different. The grass there was brown like everything else, but the root system, when he'd crouched down and tested it, was deeper than it should have been. The soil held more moisture than the surrounding land. There were plants there that had no reason to exist in this drought unless they were pulling water from somewhere the drought hadn't reached. He had an idea about what that somewhere might be. It was a big idea. It required money he didn't have and labor that currently consisted of himself and a 16-year-old boy and whatever peripheral help 3 younger children and 1 determined 7-year-old could provide. It was, by most reasonable assessments, a foolish idea. It was also possibly the only idea. He told Cole about it on a Saturday evening, sitting on the porch after supper, when the worst of the day's heat had finally retreated and the sky was doing the thing it sometimes did out here, going colors that seemed impossible, deep orange and copper and a thin line of green along the horizon that disappeared if you looked at it directly. Cole listened. He didn't interrupt. When Rhett finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "A spring," Cole said. "Underground. Maybe. The signs are there." "What does it cost to find out?" "Digging equipment. My savings would cover the equipment." Rhett paused. "It would leave us nothing else. And if you're wrong?" "Then I'm wrong, and we're broke, and we lose the ranch anyway." He looked sideways at Cole. "But if I'm right, underground water on this land would make it worth 5 times what the note is for," Cole said, without hesitation. He'd already run the numbers. Of course he had. "More," Rhett said. "In this drought. Water rights out here." He stopped. "It changes everything. For the land, for all of us." Cole was quiet again. A coyote called somewhere out in the dark, and another answered from farther away. Lily's chickens shifted and muttered in the coop. "When do we start?" Cole said. Rhett looked at him. "You don't have to." "When do we start?" Cole repeated, and his voice had that quality again. The one that was 16 and 45 simultaneously. The one that had kept 4 younger siblings alive on the frontier for 2 months. "Monday," Rhett said. Cole nodded. He leaned back against the porch post and looked at the impossible sky. "Okay," he said simply. "Monday." But the frontier, and the men who'd made themselves powerful on it, had its own plans for the week that followed. On Sunday afternoon, 2 riders appeared at the property's main gate. One was a man named Cal Denton, who worked as a kind of legal errand boy for the Cattlemen's Lending Association. The other was a man Rhett recognized as being in Hargrove's employ, though he'd never learned his name. A large, quiet man whose quietness was the specific kind that communicates capability rather than peace. Rhett walked to the gate. In the yard behind him, he was aware of Cole drifting closer without being directed to. Denton produced a paper from his coat. "Formal notice of accelerated debt recall, Mr. Calloway. The association has reviewed your account and, given the deteriorating condition of the collateral property and your current financial position, has invoked the acceleration clause. The full amount of the note is now due in 30 days rather than November 15th. Rhett looked at the paper. It was real. It had the association's seal on it. "On what grounds is the property classified as deteriorating?" "Independent assessment was conducted last week." Denton's voice was pleasant and entirely empty. "The findings support the classification." "I wasn't notified of any assessment." "The clause doesn't require notification for external assessments." Denton folded the paper back into his coat. 30 days, Mr. Calloway. I trust you'll make the necessary arrangements." The large, quiet man said nothing. He just sat on his horse and looked at the property with the calm, comprehensive attention of someone taking inventory. Rhett held the gate and said nothing until the 2 riders had turned and moved back down the trail. Then he stood in the dust they'd left and looked at the paper in his hand. 30 days. He heard Cole behind him. What did they say? Rhett folded the paper and put it in his shirt pocket. He turned around. Cole was standing 6 feet away, and behind Cole, on the porch, Ada had appeared in the doorway with Lily at her side, both of them watching. He could have softened it. He thought about softening it for approximately 2 seconds, and then he looked at Cole's face and understood that softening it would be an insult to everything the boy had already survived. "They moved the deadline up," Rhett said. 30 days now. Cole's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes went very still, the way a pond goes still just before the wind comes. "That's legal?" "There's a clause." Apparently, Rhett's voice was quiet and controlled. "Hargrove knows about the spring. Or suspects. Someone must have talked." Cole looked at the trail where the 2 riders had disappeared. "Or someone was watching," he said. And he was right, Rhett realized. Someone had been watching. Someone had assessed the property last week, had walked the ridgeline perhaps, and seen what Rhett had seen, had understood what the vegetation pattern meant, and had moved to take the land before its value could be proven. 30 days to find the spring, 30 days to prove the value of the land, 30 days to raise $340, or watch everything. The ranch, the roof, the chicken coop with its 6 named chickens, revert to the association and be absorbed into Marcus Hargrove's already enormous holdings. Rhett stood in his own yard in the failing afternoon light and felt the full weight of it, the exhaustion, the inadequacy of his resources, the arrogance of powerful men moving against a broke rancher and 5 orphaned children without the slightest concern about what it cost those children, because powerful men in 1883 Texas did not require concern of themselves. He felt all of it, and then he folded it up the same way he'd folded that paper and put it in a place where it would not slow him down and turned back to the house. "Get Cole," he said to Ada. "Tell Danny to put the tools by the porch. We start early tomorrow." Ada looked at him steadily. "How early?" "Before sunrise," he said. She nodded and disappeared into the house, already reorganizing. Lily stood in the doorway alone now, watching him with those enormous eyes. He walked up the porch steps and stopped in front of her. She looked up at him without fear, which was something he'd noticed about her, that she had moved from wariness to trust with a directness that bypassed all the intermediate stages. It was either wisdom or innocence, and he was no longer sure there was a difference. "Are we going to be okay?" she asked. Rhett crouched down so he was at her level. The honest answer lived in the space between them. Complicated, unresolved, full of variables he couldn't control. He looked at her face and thought about what was true, not what was easy. "I think so," he said. "But it's going to be hard for a while." Lily considered this with the gravity it deserved. "Okay," she said, "I can do hard." She said it the way she'd said everything since he'd known her, with a simplicity that contained more than it appeared to, like a small container holding something much larger than its size should allow. I know you can, Rhett said. He stood up. The sun was going down over the western ridge, and the sky was doing its impossible colors again, and 30 days lay ahead of them like a stretch of terrain with no clear path through it. They had a ranch under siege, a debt being weaponized against them, and an idea that might be nothing or might be everything. Tomorrow, before the sun came up, they would start digging. They started before the sun. Rhett was at the ridge by 4:30, carrying 2 shovels, a pickaxe, and a lantern that threw a small, determined circle of light against the pre-dawn dark. Cole was behind him, managing the wheelbarrow they'd borrowed from the barn with the quiet efficiency that had become his signature. No complaint about the hour, no comment on the cold that had settled into the high ground overnight. Just boots on rocky soil and hands around the handles and eyes already scanning the terrain ahead. The strip of unusual vegetation looked different in lantern light. Smaller, somehow. More ordinary. Rhett stood at the edge of it and felt the particular doubt that always arrives in the dark. The suspicion that what seemed like evidence in daylight is merely wishful thinking at 4:30 in the morning. Cole stopped beside him. He set the wheelbarrow down and looked at the ground. This is it? This is it. Cole crouched and pressed his palm flat to the earth the way Rhett had shown him. Held it there, stood up. Feels different, he said. Not enthusiastic, just factual. Yes. Could be a lot of things. Could be. Cole picked up a shovel. Only one way to find out, he said, and drove the blade into the ground. They worked in shifts, Rhett and Cole alternating on the pickaxe and shovel as the terrain required, breaking through the surface rock with the pickaxe and clearing debris with the shovel into the wheelbarrow, which Danny and Pete took turns running to the dumping spot 30 yards north. The boys had appeared at the ridge just after 6, materializing out of the early light with the purposefulness of people who have decided they belong somewhere. Rhett had looked at them, opened his mouth to send them back, and then closed it again. Pete was 11. Danny was 9. The wheelbarrow was within their capacity, and the alternative was leaving them at the house with nothing to do but think about the 30-day deadline. You push, you don't dig, Rhett told them, and the moment it gets too heavy, you ask for help. Both of you. Danny had given him a look of mild offense. Pete had simply taken the handles. Ada came up at 7 with water and cornbread wrapped in cloth. She set it on a flat rock without ceremony and looked at the pit they'd already opened. 18 inches deep and roughly 4 feet across, raw and ragged at the edges, the disturbed earth dark against the pale surface soil. You're going to need it deeper, she said. I know, Rhett said. How much deeper? Don't know. Could be 6 feet, could be 20. Ada looked at the pit for a moment. I'll bring more water at noon, she said, and went back down the hill. That was Ada. No drama, no false comfort, just a clear-eyed assessment of what was needed and a commitment to providing it. Lily appeared briefly around 9, stood at the edge of the pit, regarded it with the same serious attention she gave everything, and announced that the chickens had each laid an egg that morning, which was apparently a record. She seemed to feel this was relevant information to the proceedings. Then she went back down to tend them. The work was not romantic. It was the kind of labor that reduces a person to their simplest components, muscle and will, and the ability to keep moving when the reasonable part of the mind has already advocated for stopping. The rocky terrain fought them at every depth. At 2 feet, they hit a shelf of limestone that required an hour of pickaxe work to breach. At 3 feet, the soil changed texture, darker, cooler, holding itself differently, and Rhett felt a cautious shift in his gut that he was careful not to voice. Cole noticed the soil change, too. He said nothing about it, but he worked harder. By the end of the first day, they were 4 feet down and the pit had grown to roughly 6 feet across. Every muscle in Rhett's body had filed a formal complaint. Cole moved more slowly than he had in the morning, but had not stopped, had not complained, had accepted each cup of water Ada brought with a nod and kept going. Danny and Pete had graduated from the wheelbarrow to helping clear loose debris from the pit's edge with their hands, working with the focused dedication of boys who understand that what they're doing matters. Rhett stood at the bottom of the pit that evening and put his hand to the soil and felt it. Cool. Definitively cool in a way the surface was not. He closed his eyes and tried to read something in it beyond temperature, some confirmation, some certainty. There was none. There was only cool soil and the possibility it represented, and the 28 days remaining on the deadline. He climbed out of the pit. Cole was sitting on the wheelbarrow's edge, forearms on his knees, watching him. "Well?" Cole said. "Still possible," Rhett said. "That's the same thing you said this morning." "Because it's still true." Cole was quiet for a moment. "Do you actually believe it's there?" Rhett looked at the pit, at the disturbed earth around it, at the particular quality of the soil on his hands, darker than the surface, holding moisture the drought hadn't reached. "Yes," he said. "I believe it's there." Cole held his gaze for a beat, then nodded. "Okay," he said. "Same time tomorrow." They were not the only ones watching the ridge. Rhett noticed the rider on the third day. A single figure on the high ground to the north, too far to identify clearly, sitting still with the particular patience of someone who is observing rather than passing through. He watched the figure for several minutes, then went back to work. When he looked again an hour later, the rider was gone. He mentioned it to Cole that evening. "Hargrove's man," Cole said without particular surprise. "Probably. He wants to know if we're finding something. If we find it before the 30 days, the land's value changes. Changes whether the association can legally enforce the recall at the terms they set." Rhett's jaw was tight. "If they think we're close, they'll move faster." Cole thought about this. "So we need to be close faster. We need to be close before they decide to do something about it." What that something might look like, neither of them said aloud. They had enough to carry. On the 5th day, the pit reached 7 feet, and the soil was markedly different, dark and dense, with a faint dampness that was unmistakable to anyone who had been studying the soil for a week. Rhett and Cole came up from the pit that afternoon and stood in the fading light and looked at each other with the expression of men who do not want to say what they're thinking, in case saying it makes it less true. It was Danny who said it. He'd been watching from the edge of the pit all afternoon, his 9-year-old face absolutely intent. "It smells like water," he said. Rhett looked at him. "What?" "Down there." Danny pointed into the pit. "It smells like water, like when we used to walk down to the creek back home before it dried up. That smell." He wrinkled his nose slightly, identifying it. "It's down there." Rhett crouched at the edge of the pit and breathed in. The smell was faint, faint enough that he hadn't consciously registered it. But Danny was right. Beneath the dry dust and disturbed rock, there was something else, something mineral and cool and alive. He looked up at Cole. Cole's expression had changed. The careful blankness he maintained as a default was gone, replaced by something he was visibly trying to contain, trying not to let become hope until hope was warranted, but failing, slightly. 7 feet isn't deep enough, Rhett said, but we're getting closer. How do you know? Danny asked. Because you can smell it, Rhett said, and you've got a better nose than me. Danny stood up straighter, enormously pleased with this assessment. But the world does not hold its complications in suspension while hopeful people dig holes in the ground. On the 8th day, Cal Denton came back. He came in the morning before they'd gone up to the ridge, and he brought a document that was several pages longer than the last one and considerably more threatening in its language. Rhett read it at the kitchen table while Denton stood in the doorway with his pleasant, empty face arranged in an expression of professional regret. The document claimed that Rhett had violated the terms of the original loan agreement by materially altering the condition of the collateral property through excavation activities, and that this violation permitted the association to initiate immediate foreclosure proceedings rather than honoring even the 30-day recall period. Rhett read it twice. He set it down. He looked at Denton. The excavation is on my property, within my legal rights as the title holder, and it represents improvement activity rather than damage, he said. Your clause requires damage. You'd need a judge to agree with your interpretation, and I suspect a judge would want to hear both sides. Denton's pleasant expression didn't flicker. The association has significant relationships with the judiciary in this territory, Mr. Calloway. I'm sure it does, Rhett said. I'm also sure that significant relationships and legally binding rulings are different things. Tell your employer that if he wants my land, he'll have to do it properly, which gives me the remainder of my 30 days. After Denton left, Rhett sat at the table for a moment. Cole was standing in the doorway to the kitchen. He'd appeared silently sometime during the exchange, the way he had a habit of doing. They're scared, Cole said. They're powerful, and they're moving against us. That's different from scared. Cole leaned against the doorframe. No, he said, with a certainty that was striking in a 16-year-old. If they weren't scared of what we might find, they'd just wait out the 30 days and take the land clean. They're pushing now because they want us to stop digging. He paused. Which means we shouldn't stop digging. Rhett looked at him for a moment. No, he agreed. We shouldn't. They went back to the ridge. Days 10 through 14 were the hardest. The limestone shelf at 9 feet was the worst they'd encountered. A solid barrier that the pickaxe addressed only in fragments, each blow producing a sharp ring of metal on rock and a small, inadequate result. Rhett's hands blistered, and the blisters tore, and he wrapped them and kept going. Cole's hands did the same, and he did the same. They worked in silence much of the time, because speech required energy they were directing elsewhere, and because some things don't benefit from being talked about. They benefit only from being done. Ada had begun rationing the food with a precision that she did not discuss, but that Rhett observed and understood. The portions were smaller than they'd been in the first week. She managed it without drawing attention to it, making the meals flavorful enough that the quantity was less immediately obvious, using spices and technique to compensate for volume. But the flour was genuinely running out, and the salt pork was nearly gone, and the eggs from Lily's chickens were doing genuine nutritional work that they had not been designed to carry alone. Rhett said nothing about the food situation to the children. Ada said nothing about it to the younger ones. Cole said nothing at all, which meant he knew. It was on the 15th day that Pete found the seep. He'd been clearing debris from the northeast corner of the pit, a corner Rhett had been about to abandon as less promising, when he called up in his quiet, precise way, "Mr. Calloway, there's something wet here." Rhett was in the opposite corner. He crossed the pit in 2 steps and crouched beside Pete, and what he saw in the corner, in the faint seam where the dark soil met the face of the limestone, was a thin thread of moisture. Not water flowing, not even dripping, just wet. The rock was wet. The soil against it was wet. In the brutal drought of July 1883, with the creek bed a dry scar and the grass dead to its roots, and the sky a bleached and waterless white, this small, unremarkable wetness was the most significant thing Rhett Calloway had ever seen. He pressed his fingers to it and pulled them back and looked at the moisture on his skin. "Cole," he said. His voice was steady. He worked to keep it that way. Cole dropped from the pit's edge in one motion and was beside him in seconds. He looked at Pete's corner, looked at the wet rock, looked at Rhett. Neither of them said anything. "Is that it?" Pete asked. He had the careful tone of someone who wants very much to be right and is protecting against the possibility of being wrong. "It's the edge of it," Rhett said. "The water is there. We have to go in from the side now, not straight down." He sat back on his heels. 3 more days, maybe 4. "We have 15 days left on the notice," Cole said. "I know. Plenty of time. If nothing else goes wrong," Rhett said. Cole looked at him steadily. "Then nothing else goes wrong." It was a statement of will rather than fact, and they both knew it. But will was what they had, and it had gotten them 15 feet deep into the rocky earth east of Dry Creek, and it was going to have to be sufficient for whatever came next. What came next arrived on the 17th day, in the form of 3 riders. Not Denton this time. Not the quiet man whose quietness communicated capability. These were men Rhett didn't recognize, heavy-built, with the look of hired work rather than the careful legal presentation of association employees. They came in the late afternoon when Rhett and Cole were still at the ridge, and the younger children were at the house, and they went to the house first. Ada heard them coming and got the 3 younger children into the back room before the riders reached the yard. She stood on the porch alone when they arrived. Rhett learned this afterward, from Ada's own account, delivered in her flat, unsurprised voice as if she were reporting something that had happened to someone else. The riders said they were there to conduct a property inspection on behalf of the association. Ada told them the property owner wasn't present and any inspection required his authorization. The largest of the 3 had smiled and said authorization wasn't strictly necessary for a preliminary review. Ada had said, and Rhett would think about this moment for a long time afterward, "My brother is at the North Ridge, and he'll be back shortly. You're welcome to wait in the yard. You're not welcome in the house." "Your brother?" the large man had said, apparently amused. "He's 16, Ada had said. and he's very serious. The men had waited in the yard, which was their mistake, because it gave Rhett and Cole 20 minutes to come down from the ridge. Danny had seen the riders from the high ground and run for them immediately, and by the time Rhett walked into his own yard, he had sufficient composure to handle what he found there without doing something that would give the association legitimate legal grounds against him. He walked straight to the largest of the three riders. "Get off my land," he said. The large man looked down at him from his horse with the evaluating expression of someone measuring a threat. "Association business, Calloway." "Association business requires a legal order. You don't have one. Get off my land." A silence. The large man's eyes moved to Cole, who had come up beside Rhett and was standing with his arms at his sides in a posture of absolute, terrible stillness. Then to the two younger boys behind them. Then back to Rhett. "You're behind on a note," the large man said. "You're digging holes in worthless land. You've got a house full of orphans you can't feed." He let the words settle. "Hargrove's offering you a way out. Settle the note for 60 cents on the dollar, sign the property over clean, and he'll find the children proper placement." "Proper placement," Rhett said. "The older ones might get work. The young ones, there are families in San Antonio who take in children." Rhett heard Cole go very still beside him, the kind of still that is not peace. "Separate them," Rhett said. Not a question. "It's the practical solution." Rhett looked at the large man for a long moment. The anger inside him was vast and specific and controlled, which made it more dangerous than if it had been general and explosive. "I'm going to say this once," Rhett said. "Those children are not negotiating currency. They are not a problem to be distributed. They stay together, on this land, which is my land for 13 more days. And if you or any man working for Hargrove comes back to my property without a legal order, I will make it my personal and considerable project to ensure that every rancher, farmer, and dirt-poor homesteader between here and San Antonio knows exactly what kind of business the Cattlemen's Lending Association conducts." He held the large man's gaze. "We're done here." The large man looked at him. Something in his expression shifted, not softening, but recalculating. He glanced at Cole again. Then he turned his horse, and the other two followed, and they rode out of the yard without another word. Rhett stood and watched them go. When the dust had settled and the sound of hooves had faded, he became aware that the younger children had emerged from the house. Danny and Pete on the porch, Lily in the doorway behind Ada. All of them quiet. Cole was still beside him. "They'll be back," Cole said quietly. "With a legal order or without one?" "Probably," Rhett said. "How much time do we need at the ridge?" Rhett thought about the seep in the northeast corner, the lateral work they'd begun, the direction the moisture was coming from. 2 days, he said. "Maybe 3. We have 13. The 2 days I'm talking about, they're the 2 days before we break through." He paused. "Or don't." Cole nodded. He looked at the trail where the riders had gone, then turned toward the ridge. "Then we don't waste the morning," he said, and began walking. Behind them, Lily had come fully out onto the porch. She stood in the late afternoon sun with her thin arms wrapped around herself, watching her oldest brother and the man who had stopped for them walk back toward the high ground. "Ada," she said. "What?" "We're going to be okay." She said it without Rhett's qualification, without his careful, I think. She said it the way she'd said everything since the hitching post, with a simplicity that allowed no argument. Ada put her arm around her sister and looked at the ridge where Rhett and Cole were already climbing, 2 figures growing small against the enormous sky. "Yeah," Ada said, "we are." And somewhere beneath the rocky earth of the northeast corner of Rhett Calloway's failing ranch, 13 days before the deadline, water moved in the dark. Patient, waiting, ready. The 19th day began the same way the previous 18 had, before sunrise, before coffee had fully done its work, before the body had entirely reconciled itself to another round of what was being asked of it. But something was different on the ridge that morning, and Rhett felt it before he could name it. The air at the excavation site had a quality he hadn't noticed before, a coolness that wasn't just the pre-dawn temperature, but something rising from below, something the earth was exhaling from wherever the water lived. He stood at the edge of the pit and breathed it in and said nothing, because naming a thing too early could somehow make it smaller. Cole was already down in the pit, working the lateral tunnel they'd opened in the northeast corner, a narrow, horizontal shaft following the direction the moisture was coming from, reinforced with the wood planks Rhett had salvaged from the old storage shed they'd dismantled for the purpose 3 days ago. The work in the tunnel was different from the open pit, more confined, more particular, requiring a different kind of patience. Cole had taken to it with the same methodical focus he brought to everything, working in the cramped space without complaint, moving earth one careful shovelful at a time. Rhett dropped into the pit and crouched at the tunnel entrance. "How does it look?" Cole's voice came back muffled, close. "Wetter. The soil in the last foot it's different, darker. It's holding itself together differently, like it's saturated." A pause, the sound of the shovel. "I think we're close." "How close?" "I don't know. 2 feet, maybe less." Another pause. "Maybe more." "I don't want to say less than it is." "Say what you think." A brief silence. "Less than 2 feet," Cole said quietly, like a man placing a bet he can't afford to lose. Danny and Pete arrived at 7, as they had every morning for the past 2 weeks. Pete with the quiet reliability of someone who has decided this is his work. Danny with the barely contained energy of a boy for whom stillness has always been a negotiation. Ada came at 7:30 with water and the last of the cornbread, which was the last of the cornmeal, and she said this with the same flat clarity she brought to all difficult information, because she and Rhett had long since agreed that pretending things were fine consumed energy they couldn't spare. "Last of it," she said, setting it on the flat rock. "I know," Rhett said. "What do we do when it's gone?" "We find the water first," he said. "Water rights on this land, we can get credit against that. Hargrove's lawyer knows what underground water out here is worth. So does every bank between here and Austin." Ada looked at him steadily. "And if we don't find it today?" Rhett met her eyes. 13 years old, with the gaze of someone twice that. Someone who had already learned that the world does not adjust its timeline to accommodate hope. "Then we don't find it today," he said. "And we come back tomorrow." She nodded once and went back down the hill, and Rhett watched her go with something in his chest that was not quite grief, but lived near it. The feeling of watching someone young carry weight that should have been distributed differently, over more shoulders, over more years. He went back to the ridge. It was mid-morning when Cole called out from the tunnel with a different quality in his voice. Not urgent, not loud, but with a particular compression in it that brought Rhett to the pit edge in 3 strides. "Rhett." Cole had never called him by his first name before. Always Mr. Calloway, delivered with the precise courtesy of someone maintaining a boundary that mattered to him. The first name, unannounced, without preamble. That said everything. Rhett was in the pit in seconds, crouching at the tunnel entrance. "What is it? Come look." He crawled into the tunnel. The space was tight, barely wide enough for shoulders, reinforced planks above, the smell of deep earth and something else, something mineral and alive pressing in from all directions. Cole was at the end, maybe 8 feet in, kneeling with his lantern held forward. Where the tunnel face should have been solid limestone and dark soil, there was instead a crack. Vertical, running from near the top of the tunnel to the floor, perhaps a 1/4 inch wide at its broadest point, and from this crack, in the lantern light, Rhett could see moisture. Not seeping, not the thread-thin wetness of the northeast corner 3 days ago. This was movement. This was water finding its way through ancient stone toward the opening they had made for it. He and Cole crouched in the narrow tunnel and looked at it together. "If we open this," Cole said quietly, "what happens?" "Depends how much pressure is behind it." Rhett's voice was equally quiet. "Could be a trickle. Could be more." "If it's more, get out of the tunnel fast," Rhett said. "That's the rule. The moment I hit this crack with the pickaxe, you move toward the pit. Don't wait to see what happens." Cole looked at him. In the lantern light, 17 days of excavation was written on his face, the hollows under his eyes, the set of his jaw, the hands wrapped in cloth, where the blisters had finally calloused over. He nodded once. "Hit it," he said. Rhett raised the pickaxe in the confined space, awkward, the movement cramped by the tunnel walls, requiring a shortened swing that would have to do what a full swing would do. He found the crack with the point, drew back as far as the space allowed. Hit it. The sound was different from 19 days of rock and soil. A sharp, splitting crack, not the dull thud of excavation, and then a sound beneath that sound, a deep percussive grunt from within the stone, as if something enormous had been holding its breath for a very long time and had just decided to exhale. The crack widened. Water came through it in a sheet. "Move," Rhett said, and Cole was already moving, already pulling himself toward the pit entrance with the controlled urgency of someone who had understood the instruction completely. And Rhett was right behind him, the pickaxe abandoned, and then they were both out of the tunnel and standing in the pit as the water came through the tunnel in a surge. Not explosive, not catastrophic, but powerful and insistent and utterly real, spreading across the pit floor and rising, clear and cold in the morning heat, rising with a patient inevitability that said this water had been waiting down here for a very long time and was entirely comfortable taking its time now that the door was open. Cole and Rhett stood at opposite walls of the pit, feet lifting as the water reached them, and looked at each other across 4 feet of rising, clear, cold underground water in the brutal drought summer of 1883. Neither of them spoke. Some moments are too large for immediate language. It was Danny, peering over the pit's edge from above, who broke the silence. "It smells like the creek," he said, in a voice so full of wonder that it barely sounded like his own. Rhett looked up at him. Then he looked at Cole. And Cole, who had not smiled with any fullness since Rhett had known him, Cole who had kept every expression measured and every hope contained, Cole whose face had been the permanent study of a boy who had trained himself not to feel things too early. Cole put his head back and laughed. It was a real laugh, deep and sudden and helpless, the laugh of something finally, undeniably breaking loose. Rhett felt it move through him like the water was moving through the stone, finding every crack, filling every hollow, moving into spaces that had been empty so long he'd stopped noticing. He laughed too. Above them, Danny disappeared from the pit edge at a dead run, shouting for Pete, shouting for Ada, shouting in the particular register of a 9-year-old boy delivering news so significant that his entire body has become the announcement. They had 11 days left on the deadline. They had found the spring. The news moved through Dry Creek faster than fire moves through dry grass. By afternoon, riders had carried it east and west and south, some out of genuine interest, some out of disbelief, some out of the particular human compulsion to witness something that has been declared impossible. By the following morning, 3 separate parties had appeared at Rhett's property line asking to see the water, and he had shown them all with the calm patience of a man who has already processed his own astonishment and moved on to the practical question of what comes next. What came next, from Hargrove's direction, was the legal order that Denton had been threatening since the beginning. It arrived on the 21st day, a formal writ, properly executed, signed by a circuit judge named Aldous Crane, ordering the suspension of all excavation and alteration activities on the Calloway property, pending a formal review of the loan agreement terms and the association's rights to initiate early foreclosure. The writ was technically narrow. It addressed only the excavation, but its intent was not narrow at all. Its intent was to freeze everything in place long enough for the association to find a legal mechanism to take the land before its newly proven value made the original loan terms look like the theft they were. Rhett read the writ at his kitchen table with an expression that had gone very still and very careful. Cole sat across from him. "What does it mean?" "It means Hargrove found a judge." Rhett set the writ down. "The judge has ordered us to stop working the spring site pending review. If we keep digging, we're in contempt of the order. If we stop, we lose working days we can't get back." He paused. "And while we're stopped, Hargrove's people are going to push the review as fast as they can and try to execute the foreclosure before we can demonstrate the spring's value to any competing buyer or lender." "Can he do that?" Ada asked. She was standing in the kitchen doorway with Lily beside her, Lily holding Ada's hand with the careful grip of a child who understands that something important is happening even if she can't fully parse the details. "He's doing it," Rhett said. A silence settled over the kitchen. Pete and Danny, sitting along the wall, were very still in the way that children go still when adult problems become visible and large. It was Cole who spoke first. "How much does everyone know about the spring?" he said. Not to anyone in particular, thinking out loud in the way Rhett had come to recognize, working toward something. "Everyone in Dry Creek knows by now. Most ranchers in the territory will know by end of week." Rhett looked at him. "What are you thinking?" Cole was quiet for another moment. Then, "Hargrove's move works if nobody pushes back. The judge signs things for him because nobody's offered the judge any other perspective. The association runs things the way it runs things because nobody's ever had enough. Enough evidence, enough people, enough noise to make that costly. He looked at Rhett. We have evidence now. We have the spring. We have a legal loan document that was written when this land was worth a fraction of what it's worth today, by lenders who knew about the spring and said nothing. He paused. We have every rancher and homesteader in the territory who has ever been squeezed by the Cattlemen's Association watching right now to see how this ends. Rhett looked at his 16-year-old, and somewhere in the past 3 weeks, that pronoun had shifted so gradually he hadn't marked its passing. This 16-year-old boy who had walked 40 miles with 4 younger siblings and had not bent once, had not quit once, had not asked for less than the full truth a single time. What are you proposing? Rhett said. I'm proposing we don't comply with the writ quietly. I'm proposing we go to town, all of us. Cole's jaw was set. I want to stand in front of that courthouse, and I want every person in Dry Creek to see exactly who Hargrove is trying to take this land from. Rhett was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the writ, at the kitchen around him. Ada's careful management of it, visible in every organized corner, Lily's drawings tacked to the wall beside the window, a small pile of rocks Danny had arranged on the windowsill by some private taxonomy, Pete's boots by the door, always precisely placed. Then he looked at Cole. That's a significant thing to ask of your brothers and sisters. I know, Cole said. I'll ask them, not tell them. He turned to the room. Danny and Pete straightened against the wall, Ada and Lily in the doorway. I want to go to town tomorrow, Cole said to them, direct and clear, the way he'd always spoken to them, with the respect of someone who understood that being younger doesn't mean your opinion counts for less. I want us to stand together in front of the courthouse when Rhett presents his case to whoever will listen. It might not change anything, but I think it's worth doing. He looked at each of them in turn. You don't have to, any of you. Danny didn't even wait for the full sentence to finish. I'm going, Pete nodded. Me too. Ada looked at Cole for a moment with the particular look that passes between people who have survived the same hard thing together and understand each other completely. Obviously, she said. They all looked at Lily. Lily considered the question with her characteristic gravity. Then she looked up at Rhett. Will it help? She asked. I think it might, Rhett said honestly. She nodded. Then I'm going. They went to town. What happened in Dry Creek on that Thursday morning was not a planned confrontation or an organized event. It was something more organic, and because of that, more powerful. 5 children and a broke cowboy walking into the center of town with the simple and devastating visibility of people who have decided to stop being invisible. Rhett went first to the land registry office, where he filed a formal counterclaim against the association's acceleration notice, citing the discovery of the underground spring as material evidence that the original loan terms had been established using incomplete and potentially fraudulent property valuation. A valuation that he argued in his written filing the association's own assessors had conducted 2 weeks prior with full knowledge of the spring's existence, knowledge they had not disclosed to him as the borrower. It was a legal argument, it was a solid one. But legal arguments in 1883, Texas moved at the pace of whoever held the most influence over the proceedings, and Rhett knew that without external pressure, the argument might move itself right past its own deadline. The external pressure was already gathering. Word had spread that the Calloway party was in town, and the nature of towns, especially small ones, especially ones that had watched the same powerful men run things the same way for too long, is that they come to look when something genuinely different is happening. Not everyone came for the right reasons. Some came out of curiosity, some out of the particular entertainment value of watching a conflict they had no stake in. But some came because they had their own history with the Cattlemen's Association, their own notes recalled at inconvenient moments, their own assessments conducted without notification, their own experiences of watching powerful men treat legal processes as personal tools. Those people listened when Rhett spoke. He stood on the courthouse steps, not because anyone had given him the steps, but because the steps were public ground and he was a citizen with a legal filing in his hand, and he laid it out plainly. Not dramatically, not with the performance of a man playing to an audience, but with the flat, honest clarity of a man who is tired of having to explain things that shouldn't require explanation. He described the spring. He described the assessment he'd never been notified of. He described the acceleration clause invoked 9 days after his excavation began. 9 days after it became apparent that the land might be worth considerably more than the loan against it. He named Hargrove. He named Pruitt at the association. He named Judge Aldous Crane, who had signed a writ that conveniently froze Rhett's activities while the association rushed its foreclosure proceedings. Behind him, on the courthouse steps, 5 children stood. Cole stood at Rhett's right shoulder, straight, still, his arms at his sides, his face carrying the expression of someone who has made a final decision and is entirely at peace with it. Ada stood to Cole's left, one hand on Lily's shoulder. Pete beside Danny barely suppressing the impulse to look at everything at once. It was their presence, more than anything Rhett said, that seemed to do something to the people watching, because you could argue with a legal counterclaim. You could dismiss one man's grievance, but 5 children standing on courthouse steps in the August heat, having chosen to be there, having been asked rather than directed, having walked from 11 miles out to stand in plain sight, that was harder to argue with. That was something that moved through the watching crowd like the water had moved through the cracked stone, finding every hollow, filling every space. A man named Jacob Reese, a homesteader from 8 miles south, who had lost 40 acres to the association 3 years prior under circumstances he had never been able to prove were improper, stepped forward first. He stood beside Rhett on the steps without being asked. Then a woman named Clara Dodd, whose husband had borrowed from the association against their grain operation and found the terms changed at precisely the moment the operation showed promise. Then 2 brothers named Vigil, who ran cattle east of the Hargrove spread and had been watching its expansion with a long-standing and well-founded anxiety. They didn't give speeches, they just stood there. Marcus Hargrove appeared on the street below the courthouse at some point during this, Rhett didn't see exactly when, became aware of him the way you become aware of weather changing, a shift in the quality of attention from the crowd. Hargrove was flanked by 2 men and wearing the expression of someone who has arrived at a situation they expected to control and discovered it has outgrown that expectation. He and Rhett looked at each other across the width of the street. "You're making a scene, Calloway," Hargrove said. His voice was still composed, still carrying its habitual authority, but something underneath it was working harder than usual. "I'm filing a legal counterclaim," Rhett said, "and I'm doing it where people can see." "Is there a reason you'd prefer they couldn't?" Hargrove's jaw tightened. He looked past Rhett at the children on the steps, at Jacob Reese, at Clara Dodd and the Vigil brothers, and the dozen other people who had moved to stand on or near the steps. His eyes moved through the crowd and performed, Rhett could see, a rapid and unfavorable calculation. "The association operates within the law," Hargrove said, but the words were doing less work than they had in Rhett's kitchen, less work than they'd done for years in this town, because the law in question was now visible. Its seams and its uses and its convenient applications all on display in the morning sun. "Then let the law work," Rhett said simply. "Let the judge hear both sides. Let the registry process my counterclaim. Let the Springs value be assessed by a party with no interest in the outcome." He paused. "If everything is within the law, that process won't trouble you at all." Hargrove stood very still for a moment. The crowd was watching him now the way it had been watching Rhett, and the quality of the attention was different. Pointed, assessing, carrying the accumulated weight of every small injustice that had never quite added up to something actionable until this moment, when they all suddenly did. He turned and walked away. It was not a dramatic retreat. It was not a concession or a defeat. Not yet. Not in any formal sense. It was a man removing himself from a situation that had ceased to be manageable, which is sometimes more significant than any single spoken word. Rhett stood on the courthouse steps and watched him go. Cole moved to stand beside him. They stood shoulder to shoulder for a moment, the man who had stopped and the boy who had learned to start again, and looked at the street where Hargrove had been. "Is it over?" Cole asked quietly. "The easy part might be," Rhett said. Cole almost smiled. "That was the easy part?" "The legal process takes time. Hargrove still has his judge. We still have to prove the Springs value formally, on the record, in language that survives a courtroom." Rhett glanced at him. "But the town knows now. That matters. It changes what's possible." Cole nodded slowly. He looked at the people who were still gathered. talking to each other now, the formal assembly dissolving into the smaller, denser conversations that do the real work. He looked at his brothers and sisters behind them. Danny already in conversation with Jacob Reese's eldest son about something that appeared to involve horses, Pete standing quietly beside Ada, Lily sitting on the top step with her legs folded, watching everything with her enormous eyes. "She's going to remember this," Cole said, nodding toward Lily. "She'll remember all of it," Rhett said. "They all will." "Is that a good thing?" Rhett thought about it honestly. "I think it's the kind of thing that makes people who can handle whatever comes next," he said. "Which isn't the same as an easy life. But it's not nothing." Cole was quiet for a moment. Then, in the careful way he had of approaching anything that mattered. "When this is settled, the legal part, the water rights, all of it, what happens to us?" Rhett looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we're still 5 orphans, legally." Cole's voice was level, but there was something beneath the levelness that he was managing carefully, had been managing since a broken hitching post in July. "There are people who could still make a claim. Say we need to be placed somewhere, separated." Rhett was quiet for a moment. He looked at the 5 children. Danny's animated conversation, Pete's watchful stillness, Ada's capable presence, Lily's patient observation. He thought about the first night, when the house had breathing in it for the first time in years. He thought about Cole at 4:30 in the morning on the ridge, shovel already in hand. "I've been thinking about speaking to the circuit attorney," Rhett said carefully, "about formal guardianship. It's a process. It takes time and it requires the court to approve." He met Cole's eyes. "But if it's something you'd want, all of you." "I'd like to try." Cole looked at him for a long time. The same evaluation he'd performed at the hitching post in Dry Creek, the same thorough, exhausting assessment, except that this time the man being evaluated had 19 days of a ridge and a kitchen and a legal counterclaim and 4:30 mornings in the record, and the evaluation was accordingly different. "I'll ask them," Cole said finally. "Same as before. Their choice." "Of course," Rhett said. Cole nodded. He looked out at the street, at the town that had watched them this morning and had, not all of it, but enough of it, chosen to stand. Then he looked back at the courthouse steps where his family was. "Rhett," he said. "Yeah. The water. When we broke through." He paused, and something in his voice was different. Younger, perhaps, or simply less guarded than usual. "I laughed." "I know," Rhett said. "I was there. I hadn't laughed like that since before my mother died." He said it plainly, the way he said everything that mattered, without embellishment, without performance. Just the fact of it, set down in plain air. Rhett didn't say anything for a moment. The street moved around them, the town going about its afternoon. The crisis shifted, if not resolved. "You'll laugh like that again," Rhett said. "More than once, if I have any say in it." Cole looked at him. Then he did something Rhett hadn't seen before. Something small and enormous at the same time. He nodded. Not the single decisive nod of agreement or acknowledgement, but a slower, softer nod, the kind that comes from somewhere below the careful surface, from the place where a 16-year-old boy lives when he isn't holding everything together. "Okay," Cole said. And on the steps behind them, Lily had stood up and was looking toward the south road that led back to the ranch, back to the named chickens, and the water rising clear and cold from the ground, and the house that had breathing in it now. "Can we go home?" she called. Rhett turned to look at her, at all of them, at the improbable, stubborn, entirely unreasonable fact of them. "Yeah," he said. "Let's go home." The legal process moved the way all legal processes move, slowly, expensively, and with the particular indifference to human urgency that institutions develop when they have existed long enough to believe themselves permanent. But it moved. The counterclaim Rhett had filed at the Dry Creek Land Registry worked its way into the hands of a circuit judge named Harlan Moss, who was not Judge Aldous Crane and who had not, as far as anyone could determine, developed significant relationships with the Cattlemen's Lending Association. Judge Moss was 63 years old, originally from Ohio, and had spent 20 years on the frontier circuit developing a comprehensive skepticism toward arrangements that benefited the same parties repeatedly. He read Rhett's filing on a Wednesday afternoon in his office in the county seat and requested the following morning that the association produce its complete assessment records for the Calloway property going back 18 months. The association produced them on a Friday. On Saturday, Judge Moss noted that the records contained an internal survey conducted 6 weeks prior to Rhett's excavation that flagged the Northeast Ridge as a site of possible subsurface hydrological activity, warranting further investigation. A finding that had been recorded internally and disclosed to neither Rhett nor the registry office when the acceleration notice was filed. On Monday, Judge Moss voided the acceleration notice entirely. Rhett received this news at the ranch, delivered by a rider from the county seat on a morning that had started like all the others. Cole at the fence line, Danny underfoot, Pete doing something precise and methodical near the barn, Ada managing the kitchen, Lily conducting what had become an increasingly sophisticated relationship with 6 chickens who had, under her authority, raised their collective egg production to something approaching dignity. He read the letter twice, folded it, put it in his shirt pocket next to where the acceleration notice had lived for 3 weeks. Then he walked to the fence line where Cole was working and said simply, "Moss voided the notice." Cole drove a post another inch into the ground with the mallet before he responded. Then he set the mallet down and straightened up and looked at Rhett with an expression that had traveled through about 6 different things in the space of a second and arrived somewhere that was very quiet and very full at the same time. "The original November date stands?" Cole said. "The original date stands. And the association's legal exposure around the non-disclosure is significant enough that Pruitt sent a separate message this morning." Rhett reached into his other pocket and produced a second, shorter letter. "They're offering to settle the note at 40 cents on the dollar. In light of the circumstances." Cole stared at him. 40 cents. $136. Rhett allowed himself a small, controlled satisfaction. Given that a water rights buyer from San Antonio has already sent a preliminary inquiry, and that inquiry suggests the spring rights alone are worth considerably more than the original note value, I think we take it. Cole looked at the ground for a moment. Then he looked up at the sky, the wide, enormous sky that had been merciless all summer and was only now, in September, beginning to soften at the edges, the light coming in at a different angle, carrying the first faint suggestion that the season was capable of change. "We're going to be okay," Cole said. Not a question, not Lily's simple certainty, but something harder won. A statement that had passed through 19 days on a ridge and a legal counterclaim and a courthouse steps and a month of rationed cornmeal, and had come out the other side still standing. "We're going to be okay," Rhett said. Cole picked up the mallet. "I'll finish this fence section," he said, which was the most Cole Merritt way of responding to transformative news that Rhett could have imagined, and which made him feel deeply and without embarrassment, something that he had not felt since he was much younger, and the world had been arranged differently. He walked back to the house to tell the others. The months that followed were not simple. Nothing on the frontier was simple, and Rhett had long since stopped expecting simplicity as a feature of his life. But they were, differently, sustainably, good. The water rights negotiation with the San Antonio buyer, a careful man named Ellsworth who represented a land development consortium, concluded in October at terms that retired the original loan note with enough left over to repair the barn roof, purchase feed and supplies to last the winter, and buy 3 additional cattle who were, unlike their predecessors, appropriately skeptical of Rhett and therefore likely to stay. The spring itself was developed properly over the fall, engineered channels that directed the water to the pasture's north field, which had begun, in September's first real rain, to show the tentative green of recovering grass. The formal guardianship application moved through the court more slowly than the water rights negotiation, with considerably more paperwork and 2 appearances before Judge Moss that required Rhett to ride to the county seat and present himself and his circumstances and his intentions with a thoroughness that left nothing assumed. Cole attended both hearings. He was not required to attend. The proceedings concerned him as a ward rather than a participant. But he came, and he sat in the front row of the small courthouse gallery with the particular posture of someone who has decided their presence constitutes a statement, and Judge Moss noted it both times without comment. The guardianship was approved on a Thursday in November, 4 days before the date the original loan note would have been due. Rhett did not make a ceremony of telling them. He came home from the county seat in the early evening, tied copper at the post, walked into the kitchen where Ada was finishing supper and the others were distributed around the house in their various end-of-day activities, and said, "It's done." Legally, you're mine. All 5 of you. A silence. Then Danny, from somewhere in the back room. Does that mean we can get a dog? Ada covered her face with her hand. Pete made a sound that was almost certainly a suppressed laugh. Cole, sitting at the kitchen table with a book he'd been teaching himself from, one of 3 Rhett had brought back from Dry Creek 2 weeks prior, set the book down and looked at Rhett with an expression that had finally given up the last of its careful containment. Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway. She had been outside with the chickens, and she was holding one of them, the largest, named Margaret, who had been named for reasons Lily had never fully explained, under one arm with the comfortable authority of a child who has made her sovereignty over a small domain absolute. She looked at Rhett. "We're staying?" she said. "You're staying," he said. She set Margaret down on the kitchen floor, which was inadvisable for several reasons, and crossed the kitchen and put her arms around Rhett's waist and pressed her face against his chest. He put his hand on the back of her head, the thin shoulders under his palm, the whole small weight of her leaning into him. He stood very still and held on. Behind him, Margaret the chicken regarded the kitchen with imperial disdain and began walking toward the bread on the table, and Ada intercepted her with the weary efficiency of someone who has accepted that this is simply what kitchens are like now. The winter was the hardest and the best. Hard because the frontier does not suspend its requirements for sentiment. The work was relentless. The cold came in through the places the house still needed repair. The cattle required attention in weather that made attention unpleasant, and 5 growing children eat considerably more than the math ever seems to fully account for in advance. But best because the house was full in every sense of the word, full of noise and argument and laughter, and the specific domestic texture of people who are learning each other's habits and finding, in the learning, the architecture of something that will last. Cole read everything Rhett had and then asked for more, and Rhett rode to Dry Creek and came back with more. And by February, Cole was reading things that Rhett hadn't read himself and discussing them at the kitchen table with the focused enthusiasm of someone who has discovered that his mind is considerably larger than the circumstances of his early life had given it room to be. Rhett listened to these discussions with something that he eventually identified, without particular ceremony, as pride. Ada had a talent for numbers that she had been exercising in the margins of necessity, rationing food, calculating supplies, and that expanded, given room, into something more formal. Rhett found a woman in Dry Creek named Harriet Vance, who had taught school in Missouri before the frontier had taken her somewhere else, and an arrangement was made where Ada went to town twice a week and sat at Harriet's kitchen table and worked through arithmetic, and then, quickly, through what came after arithmetic. Danny remained in motion, congenitally and without apology, and directed his energy into the horses with a natural aptitude that made Copper, who had endured much, seem actively relieved to have someone who understood him. Pete built things, quietly, methodically, without announcing his projects until they were complete, at which point it became apparent that the fence corner or the tool rack or the water channel modification had been not merely repaired but improved, in ways that demonstrated an engineering sensibility that would, in another 20 years and a different context, have built bridges. And Lily kept her chickens. Margaret and the 5 others became 7 and then 11 as spring approached, and the egg production that Lily had always attributed to proper naming and consistent conversation became a genuine contribution to the household economy, and she managed it with the same combination of seriousness and love that she brought to everything she cared about. The town of Dry Creek changed its relationship with the Calloway Ranch, the way towns change their relationships with things that have proven themselves, gradually, without explicit acknowledgement, and with the collective human talent for behaving as if the current arrangement had always been the obvious one. The same people who had averted their eyes from 5 hungry children beside a broken hitching post now stopped Rhett on the main street and asked after them by name, and some of them meant it sincerely, which Rhett accepted, and some of them were performing a revised relationship with a family that had turned out to be worth knowing, which Rhett also accepted because he had long since stopped requiring people to be better than they were before he dealt with them. Marcus Hargrove left the territory in February. The non-disclosure finding in Judge Moss's ruling had generated a formal inquiry by the state banking office into the association's lending practices, an inquiry that had the particular quality of things that, once started, tend to find more than they were specifically looking for. The association restructured. Pruitt retired. Two of the other major investors in the association's operation found reasons to be elsewhere. The power that Hargrove had built over 20 years in Dry Creek did not collapse dramatically. It eroded the way things erode when the conditions that sustain them are no longer present. Rhett did not take particular satisfaction in this. He noted it with the same level of attention he gave to everything, and then went back to the work. By the following summer, the summer of 1884, 1 year after a broke cowboy had ridden into Dry Creek with $11.40 and a tired horse, and no plan for what came next. The ranch was something he didn't have a precise word for, not thriving in the extravagant sense that word sometimes carries, but genuinely alive. The north pasture was green from the spring's water. The cattle were up to 9. The barn was sound. The house had been repaired in stages through the winter and spring, each repair the work of whoever had the skill or the time, which meant the southwest corner was Cole's careful carpentry, and the porch step was Pete's improved design, and the kitchen window that had stuck since February was Ada's methodical problem-solving applied over a patient afternoon. The community celebration that summer was not a formal event. It was the kind of thing that happens in small places when enough goodwill accumulates without a particular outlet. A gathering at the Calloway property on a Saturday in July, people arriving through the morning with food and instruments, and the general willingness to sit outside and be in each other's company that a long winter and a hard year can produce. Jacob Reese came, and Clara Dodd, and the Vigil brothers, and Harriet Vance, and a dozen others who had stood on courthouse steps, or who hadn't stood anywhere but felt now that standing somewhere might be possible. May Sutton came from town with a pie and set it on the table in the yard and looked around the property with the eyes of someone comparing it to a memory. "Different," she said to Rhett. "From what?" "From what I heard it was before." She looked at the green pasture, the repaired barn, the children distributed across the yard in various states of activity, Danny in animated conversation near the horses, Pete helping Jacob Reese's son with something structural and fence-related, Ada and Harriet Vance in the particular deep discussion they always seemed to fall into, Lily moving through the adults with Margaret the chicken under her arm, introducing them to each other with the social confidence of an excellent host. "It wasn't much before," Rhett said. "No," May agreed, "but look at it now." He looked at it, tried to see it fresh, the way May was seeing it, the green and the activity and the sound of more people than this land had probably ever held. A year ago, he had stood at the edge of this property and added up what it lacked. He had been doing that arithmetic for so long, it had become automatic, the way breathing is automatic, and it had been a long time before he'd noticed he was doing a different kind of arithmetic now. The music started in the afternoon, a fiddle that Reese had brought, and a man named Torres who played guitar with a skill that made the fiddle want to be better than it was. And by mid-afternoon, the yard had the particular looseness that music introduces into gatherings, people moving more freely, the invisible lines between strangers becoming less definitive. It was Cole who found him near the fence line, standing slightly apart from the gathering the way Cole sometimes did. Not from absence, but from the habit of watching, of maintaining the perimeter, a habit that Rhett suspected would take years to fully relax. "You should be over there," Rhett said, nodding toward the yard. "I will be." Cole stood beside him and looked at the gathering. "I wanted to say something first." Rhett waited. Cole was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when something mattered enough that he was choosing words rather than just producing them. The fiddle carried from the yard, and somebody laughed at something, and the late July light was doing something generous with the color of the grass. "I've been thinking about the hitching post," Cole said. Rhett looked at him. "In town?" "The broken one. Where you found us." He paused. "I've thought about it a lot, about what it would have looked like from the outside. 5 kids who'd been there 6 days. People walking past." He stopped. "I've thought about all the people who kept walking." "Cole?" "I'm not saying it as an accusation," Cole said quickly. "I know people have their own... I understand why people kept walking. I've kept walking past things myself since. Things I didn't know how to carry." He paused again. "I'm saying it because I want to understand the difference between keeping walking and stopping." He looked at Rhett. "What made you stop?" Rhett was quiet for a moment. He thought about that afternoon. The heat, the sound, the way 5 children had been pressed against a building in a narrow strip of shade, the way everyone else had kept moving, the specific quality of the small girl's whimper that had found him through all the street noise. "I heard Lily," he said, "that sound she was making, like someone who'd been hoping for a long time and had almost stopped." He paused. "I'd made that sound myself once. Didn't think about it exactly. I just stopped." Cole absorbed this. "That's all it was?" "That's all it was." Rhett looked at him. Sometimes the whole thing is just that. Hearing a sound you recognize and not walking past it. Cole nodded slowly. He looked out at the yard, at his brothers and sisters moving through the gathering. Danny laughing, Pete intent, Ada in conversation, Lily, charming adults with a chicken, and his face had the expression it sometimes had now, the expression that was new since the spring, since the water, since the courthouse steps. Open in a way it hadn't been, carrying less in the visible sense, redistributing the weight somehow. "I want to tell you something," Cole said. "All right." He turned to face Rhett directly, the way he did when what he was saying was going to be said exactly once and needed to land properly. "You're the father we didn't have," he said. I know that's a large thing to say. I know you didn't sign up for it from the beginning, but it's what's true, and I've been waiting for the right moment to say it, and I think..." He looked briefly at the gathering, the music, the green pasture behind the yard. "I think this might be it." Rhett stood very still. He thought about everything he might say in response. The practical deflections, the modest qualifications, the careful acknowledgments. He had a talent for those. He had been using that talent to manage his own interior weather for a long time. He looked at Cole, 16, nearly 17 now, with the posture of a man and the eyes that had started to hold, cautiously and incrementally, the expression of someone who is beginning to believe that things might continue to be okay. "Thank you," Rhett said. Just that. Because some things are large enough that deflection is an insult, and this was one of them. Cole nodded. Then he looked back at the yard. "Danny's going to try to get on one of the horses," he observed in his normal tone. Rhett looked. Danny was indeed drifting toward the horses with the casual trajectory of someone who has a plan he hasn't announced. "He won't manage it," Rhett said. "No," Cole agreed. "But he'll try for 20 minutes first, and then we'll have to get involved." "Better go." "Better go," Cole confirmed. He pushed off the fence and walked back toward the gathering, and Rhett watched him go. Watched him move through the people in the yard, stopping when someone spoke to him, answering with the direct, thoughtful brevity that was entirely and completely Cole, moving eventually toward his brothers and sisters the way he always had. The gravitational pull of it unchanged by the year that had passed, or the ranch that had changed, or the legal document that had assigned him a new category. Lily spotted Rhett still at the fence line and broke from whatever conversation she'd been presiding over to cross the yard to him, still carrying Margaret with the practiced ease of a child who has fully integrated a chicken into her daily operations. "Why are you over here?" she asked. "Just thinking," he said. She regarded this as insufficient. "You should be over there." "I know." He looked at the gathering, the music, the green pasture, the people who had come because something here had proven worth coming to. "I was just looking at it for a moment." Lily looked at it too, with her particular serious attention. Margaret the chicken regarded it with imperial indifference. "It's good," Lily said. Simple, complete. The whole assessment in 2 words. "Yeah," Rhett said, "it is." She took his hand, her small one in his, the grip confident and unsentimental, the grip of someone who is not asking for reassurance but simply establishing a connection as a matter of preference, and tugged him toward the yard. He let himself be led. The fiddle found a new tune as he came back into the gathering, something faster and lighter, and Torres's guitar followed it with obvious pleasure, and the late afternoon light lay across the green pasture and the repaired barn, and the people moving in the yard like something that had taken a long time to get here and intended to stay a while. Rhett Calloway stood in the middle of it, the improbable, stubborn, entirely unreasonable fact of it, with a 7-year-old's hand in his and the knowledge that the greatest thing he had ever done in his life had begun with nothing more than hearing a sound he recognized and being unable to keep walking. He had stopped for 5 forgotten children on the worst day of a bad summer, and from that one simple, unremarkable act of stopping, everything. The frontier would have many stories after this one. It was built for stories, the wide land, the difficult sky, the people who came out to it looking for something and found something else entirely. But the story of the cowboy who stopped at the broken hitching post in Dry Creek on a July afternoon in 1883 would move through the territory in the particular way that true things move, not in proclamations or monuments, but in the repeated quiet telling, one person to another, the way people pass along things they believe it matters to remember. Not because it was exceptional in the end, but because it was possible, and because one man had stopped long enough to find that out. End.